laws. Decora, we know that ICWA maybe has not been as effectively implemented, and we know that and thank you, for saying that. The South Dakota, where we live in the Oglala Lakota Nation, which was within the state boundaries of South Dakota. We don't live in South Dakota. We live in our own nation. I think that's important to acknowledge. But we see within our nation, and what the state of South Dakota is doing to our children, and we heard a lot about people not having true representation and help when their children were taken, many times without calls. And I know I can't get into specifics because those testimonies were done in a certain way, and so I will not violate their privacy or the rights. But it was heartbreaking to hear these stories, and so it matters that we make sure that this is implemented, because the reality of it is, as we go forward, our people need representation against when these issues come up. Now that we're not perfect and we don't have issues, we heard people talk about not being able to adopt their own family members or to foster their own family members. We talked about people not having proper legal help, that they would rather pay white families outside of the Oglala Lakota Nation and the Cheyenne River Nation. They'd rather pay those people to take care of our children than to help us get the help that we need in our own nation. That, quite honestly, they're the cause of. Did you find that need for representation being the thing that you're hearing over and over again, that our people are being tried and kids stolen without true representation that they deserve?
Yes, the number of times that I've heard that during this process is outstanding. The need for representation is huge, and there was a lot of individuals that didn't know how to navigate the process, and I feel like they, because of that, they had been taken advantage of. They had a disadvantage because they just didn't know how the system worked, and nobody was there to tell them. And it's really important because, the Indian Child Welfare Act, it has provisions to help protect children. And it's really important that we protect ICWA, because all of these individuals, if ICWA is struck down, they won't have a chance. And so that really goes hand in hand with what we need. And we need to protect ICWA so that we can help our people through this process and through this, extended family members who want to step up. So thank you.
And again, I know we're near the end. I just got a couple more things. Dove, one of the questions that we got, one of the comments is, how do you feel about calling us nations instead of Native people, specifically Lakota, Sioux, MHS, Ojibwa? Much of the legal hurdles seem to stem from labeling ourselves as a race. And I know that, depending on where, both of those are kind of interchangeable, right? Sometimes we say Native, sometimes we say our particular nations when we're dealing with multiple. Is that kind of the foundation of what you're seeing, is the attack because they're not recognizing our sovereignty as nations and just trying to classify us as a race?
Yeah, it's a good question. And that is what's happening. I mean, we'll see what the court decides. But that is sort of how, that's the risk that we're facing, is that the court will reinterpret its long understanding of Native people as members of tribal nations, which, by the Constitution's words, are on equal footing with the foreign nations and the domestic states. So the states of the United States and foreign nations like France or, Chile or whatever, Chile. So that's the risk. And what comes with it is a total revision of what the U.S. has, even when it was, fighting against Native people, like it always has been, but when the laws were not supposed to help Native people, but explicitly to hurt them, it was still on the basis of their membership in these nations, right? You're at war with them, that you can't trust a nation you're at war with, etc. There's almost some respect you have to give to that, where, yeah, the policies were genocidal, but at least they were acknowledging the nation to nation relationship. Now it's just, it's a war on people as individuals. And it's when you racialize people. I mean, someone mentioned this in the chat, but it's dividing and conquering. It's you water that person down to their individualness. Oh, you're this race, you're that race. It's no longer about your connection to culture or to community or to sovereignty. Uh, but when we wrote this brief, we had to be careful with our words too, because when you use the word tribal nation in a court, it also has the ring of how do I say? It can be viewed as too headstrong, and you have to use a technical words, which is not tribal nation, but tribe or Indian tribe. You can't use indigenous people in the court. You have to use Indians, and that comes with its own set of loadedness. And yeah, there's a comment here in the chat that this government will never want to work with indigenous people, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. But while we're at it, we have to take or make the most of the positive things, which is even if we could see them as figureheads with minimal power. The head of the interior, the first person to oversee the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who's a Native person, is in power right now, right? Deb Haaland. She's not perfect. She has to report to the big man, but she also is, a sign that things are changing. The head of the National Park Service is a Native man. Many of the interior people are Native people, and so it's a weird time. There's a lot of tokenization, but on the other hand, there's possibly a window towards somewhat of a better future. And just to stress with ICWA, it's not a perfect solution, but on the other hand, it's without it, there's nothing. So if we can find a way for it to be strengthened, if it's not struck down, if for it to be strengthened, that's a possibility. But if the law is struck down, well, it's going to be really, really hard to find a legislative solution to that, because the court has already said, well, it's unconstitutional. And it will matter. This is more of a technical discussion for another time, but it will matter if the court strikes the law, on what basis it does so. Because there's two questions. One is whether it's racist, basically, and the other is whether it improperly forces states to enact a law that the federal government can't force a state to enact. Like in this case, it's a family law issue, and states are usually the only ones in charge of family law issues. So can the feds force the states to follow a family law, to enforce a family law matter that the feds are requiring? That's a separate question. So if the court says, well, it's not racist, but it violates states' rights, well, then states like New Mexico already states will be in a position to write their own versions of ICWA, which might be a better way forward. So on the other hand, we need to acknowledge that, this is all happening on all stolen land. It's happening in courts that maybe power views as legitimate. But if you are in my shoes, if you're, believe in sovereignty and indigenous struggle, these courts are illegitimate. But that doesn't mean we can't and shouldn't be working through them, partially because they do have enormous power at the end of the day, and we can't ignore that either.
Absolutely. Decora, I want to thank y'all so much for joining us. The insight, the education, the inspiration that you brought to this conversation.